April 17th, 1935. Coogee Beach, Australia. Sharks have cemented themselves in the human fear consciousness. The idea of some toothy monster rising from the abyss to latch onto you and drag you down below is a fear that perhaps everyone has thought about at one point or another. However, what would transpire all the way back in 1935 in Australia could be one of the most unique starts to a murder investigation I have ever seen, and is one of the more famous murder mysteries and cases in Sydney's long history. This is not just a fisherman's tale, but instead one of a brutal slaying that remains mostly unsolved. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, a perplexing tale of a murdered man's arm being discovered in the belly of a shark with connections to the criminal underworld. This is the Shark Arm Murders. Welcome back to today's episode. I am your host, Dominic. I'm glad you are back for this week's episode. It is starting to warm up where I am in my neck of the woods. The winter is starting to transition to spring. You know, that seasonal depression is wearing off, and I'm jacked up and I'm excited. Obviously, winter has its time in the place. I love the winter. However, I'm very excited the warmer weather's here. I'm hoping it just kind of sticks around. But with that being said, today's episode brings us back into the realm of unsolved crimes. And today's episode in particular is a very peculiar one in which definitely doesn't start like a normal unsolved murder or missing persons case. And unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence and kind of direction this case has, it might be a little bit on the shorter end. And for that, I apologize. However, this story itself is kind of just long enough to kind of put itself outside of the reach for it to be a topic on a dual topic episode, but it has just enough meat there for me to be able to cover it for a full-length episode. However, in addition to that, it kind of seems like the consensus from what I read, from whether that's Spotify comments, whether that's my YouTube comments, is that the consensus out there is that a lot of you listeners are more interested in the true crime stories, and I'm trying to take that feedback in stride and do more true crime related episodes. However, those of you who still like cryptids, monsters, mysteries, UFOs, I will not forget about you. I promise I will still be covering those, but it seems like a lot of my listeners are interested in the true crime realm, and I'm all about that. I love true crime as well. But I will still focus on everything else. But if you see me do maybe a little bit more true crime episodes, that might be why. But just giving you that little knowledge nugget, I guess. But with all that being said, let's talk about today's episode and kind of give an overview before we dive right in. So how today's episode is going to go is that I'm first going to talk about where our story takes place, a little bit about the history of shark attacks in Australia, and then go into the story and the prime suspect of the murders in question. Now, I know on the surface this might seem boring, but trust me, it's not. This is a truly unique murder case, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. So with that being said, let's talk about where this story takes place. Coogee Beach is an idyllic suburb of Sydney, Australia, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's spelled Coogee Beach, or Coogee. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So from now on, I'm just going to call it Coogee. If I am saying that wrong, somebody correct me in the comments, and I appreciate it. It has picturesque white sand beaches, a thriving restaurant scene, and a trail system that runs by the oceanfront to many other beaches nearby. Coogee is also home to the aquarium baths, which unfortunately closed in 1986. However, that is where our story will take place, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Overall, Coogee and Coogee Beach are a great vacation spot and peaceful retreat. However, in Australia, the threat of the oceans containing vicious predators that feast on humans is very much real. In America, we often think of shark attacks as a once-in-a-blue-moon phenomenon where an unlucky person could meet their end by thrashing too much in the water. Our fear of sharks, of course, is perpetuated from Hollywood, with Jaws perhaps being what everyone first thinks about when somebody says shark attack. Also, perhaps, all of the Sharknado movies. However, I'm getting off track. Australia, although it ranks second in shark attacks by country, the United States being first, of course, Australia has the highest fatality rate from shark attacks in comparison to any other country, and this is due to a variety of factors. Most of the shark attacks are taking place in southern Australia, in particular Queensland and New South Wales. However, when I say more prevalent, they are still extremely rare, so keep that in mind. The most deaths Australia has had due to shark attacks was back in 2020 when 6 people yearly were killed by sharks. Again, that's not a lot, but that is a lot in the grand scheme of things. The fatality rate from said shark attacks is higher in some parts of Australia because of rural towns and areas that are not as close to hospitals as some of those more populated oceanfront areas. Only 4 fatal shark attacks happened in Australia in 2023, and 15 shark related attacks happened as well that same year. Even though the United States has had more shark incidents, the fatality rate is less than that of Australia. Most recently, Australia has actually seen a spike in shark attacks, and we are only 3 months into the year. Back in February, a shark bit and killed a 17-year-old girl swimming near Bribie, I hope I pronounced that right, Bribie Island, and it marked the 3rd shark fatality in just 6 weeks. And even more recently, this past week, a surfer named Stephen Payne, who was on vacation in Australia, was mauled by a shark in Western Australia. When people heard the screams and rushed to see what was going on, only Stephen's surfboard remained with evidence of bite marks. He was presumed to be dead, however, his body has yet to be found. Now, what has inspired this rash of shark attacks currently in Australia? Who knows? And I am certainly not a marine biologist, but it is certainly something to keep tabs on for anyone taking a trip to the land down under anytime soon. Shark attacks are a real thing, albeit still extremely rare. Now, in the case of the shark arm murders, the shark is, shockingly, not the culprit this time. With that being said, now let's start our story of the shark arm murders by rewinding quite a ways, all the way back to 1935. April 17th, 1935, a fisherman was fishing off of Coogee Beach when they hooked a small tiger shark. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the tiger shark, they are another apex predator of the oceans. Many people think of the great white, but tiger sharks actually have frequently attacked humans on numerous occasions and are usually very large in size, regularly getting 10 to 14 feet long. While this fisherman was fighting and battling to try and reel in this small tiger shark, a much bigger tiger shark that was roughly 11 feet long came up and ate the much smaller one whole. This left the fishermen in quite a bind, as now they had to fight the much bigger shark and try to land the bigger shark that ate his original shark. Now, when the fishermen finally landed this much bigger shark, and it was alive and it kind of survived this whole ordeal of being caught, instead of releasing it, the fishermen decided that it would be a smart idea to quote-unquote donate the shark to the Coogee Aquarium baths, where it would be quite a sight to see for the general public. Now, the following weekend would be Anzac Day, which would be pretty much Australia's version of Memorial Day for us over here in the States. And many people would be out and about on Anzac Day and celebrating the holiday, and the fishermen thought that it would be quite an attraction for the area to have an 11-foot tiger shark on display for people to see that weekend. And I fully understand that thinking. However, what happened when the shark was at the Coogee Aquarium was certainly a sight for those who were there to see it. The following weekend on Anzac Day, April 25th, the shark had garnered quite the crowd, and in the days leading up to this day, the shark was very active in his pool. He had a voracious appetite and was swimming around quite frequently and restlessly in his enclosure. During that day, the shark suddenly lost its appetite, and as onlookers were observing the shark, it began to thrash violently in the pool. People didn't know what was going on or why the shark had this sudden change in behavior, and then all of a sudden, the shark vomited. A lot. Now, in this vomit, and now currently floating in the pool with the tiger shark, was a human arm. Now, the proper authorities were called, and the aquarium personnel removed the arm from the pool, and this opened a new can of worms for where in the world could this arm have even come from? And it became a search for who out there this could be from, or who was missing an arm from a shark attack. However, when the police closely examined the arm from the guts of the shark, the arm wasn't bitten or gnawed off from a shark, but rather cut with precision, something no animal could do. This clearly was the work of human interference, but to what degree? The arm in question also had rope wrapped around its wrist, and had a pretty distinguishable tattoo on it that depicted two boxers fighting one another. Police also determined that the arm was in the smaller shark, not the bigger one. And when obviously the bigger one ate the smaller one, it in fact kind of ipso facto ate the arm. Now, the stomach acid of the shark's digestive system is extremely acidic, and it would have broke down the arm if it was in their digestive system for extended periods of time. So due to the pretty good condition of the arm, investigators concluded that the arm must have only been in the shark for a period of roughly 8 to 18 days. Now, also because of the surprisingly good condition the arm was in, this led police being able to actually pull fingerprints from the arm and match it to a Jim Smith. Smith's identity would be confirmed from his wife Gladys, who was asked to ID the arm, and his brother Edward, although I have also found his name in a different source being Edwin. So I guess take that as a grain of salt. Edward, Edwin, not really sure. Ed in some capacity, the end of it, I guess to be determined. Edward ID'd the arm as that of his brother's and said that he went missing about 3 weeks ago and that no one could find any trace as to where he went. Now, as it turns out, Jim Smith was a small-time criminal that had connections to some major figures within the criminal world. He had prior criminal convictions for smaller offenses, but nothing major. However, these minor convictions and his habit of gambling led him into the illegal gambling scene in Sydney during this time. Jim Smith was managing a billiard saloon, or as we call it here in the States, pool, and also worked at the Tattersall's Club. While working there at the Tattersall's Club is where Jim would meet a major criminal named Reginald Holmes. Now, Holmes on the surface seemed like a normal, upstanding citizen. He had a wife and 2 kids, was very involved with his local Presbyterian church. He dined frequently at the Royal Sydney Yacht Club and had a lavish home on McMahon's Point and was a boat builder by trade. Certainly many things that would not strike you as someone out of the ordinary. However, Reginald Holmes had a little bit of a side gig going on in the world of drug trafficking. Holmes would employ various men who would ride speedboats out off the coast of the country to intercept packages of cocaine that were being smuggled in through shipping vessels. The sailors aboard these vessels would dump the goods overboard, and these men employed by Holmes would go and retrieve these packages of cocaine, and by doing this, Holmes in turn would make a fortune, much more than his income as a boat builder, mind you. Holmes will dabble in other crimes as well, but as the police started digging into the connections between Holmes and Jim Smith, another name would enter the fray, that of a man named Patrick Brady. Police investigating Jim Smith's sudden disappearance led them to the Cecil Hotel in Cronulla, where Jim was last seen talking to Patrick Brady, who was also a criminal and someone that police had on their radar for quite some time. Witnesses then saw Brady taking Smith to Brady's cottage, that he had rented near Gunnamatta Bay. This would be the last time anyone would see Jim Smith. The following morning, after Jim Smith would be last seen, a taxi driver came forward with a sighting that he saw Patrick Brady in his cab that following morning, and he instructed the taxi driver to bring him to the home of Reginald Holmes. As it turned out, Patrick Brady had done some work for Holmes, and although the full relationship between Brady, Smith, and Holmes might forever remain a mystery, it seems that there must have been either an intense falling out or blackmail at play of some sort. Brady and Smith also sometimes worked together. However, this mutual business relationship they had when it came to Brady, sometimes working for Holmes to help retrieve dumped contraband in the ocean, would come to a screeching halt when the two men tried to get some money through an insurance scam. The scam didn't end up paying off, and it was a massive failure. Now with the realization that maybe Holmes might end up getting burnt and bring Brady down with him, this is where the police begin to speculate that Brady started to blackmail Holmes and use his position within Sydney's higher-end society as leverage to help with blackmailing Holmes. Now, for example, what I mean by that is obviously Holmes, to a lot of people, was a pillar of the community. You know, he had a lot of things good going for him, and Brady knew this and maybe said, hey, the world doesn't know that you're smuggling cocaine. The world doesn't know that you're a drug trafficker. You don't want that to come out. You're a very high-end figure within Sydney. If that came out, that would really damage your reputation within the town, and he would most likely ultimately go to jail. Now, this is also the point where the police then suspect that Brady took Smith back to his cottage and cut his arm off, and brought it to Holmes as an example of what could happen to him or the people that he cared about. Now, this is kind of a sick and gruesome form of blackmail, if you ask me. Now, this taxi ride in question that Brady took to Reginald Holmes' house that following morning is what gave the police a reasonable assumption to think that Brady would have had something to do with the disappearance and possible murder of Jim Smith. The police would bring in both Holmes and Brady, however, the evidence was weak and merely circumstantial, and kind of relied on one of the two men to confess to the crime or rat the other one out, which at the time, neither of them did. Holmes denied ever knowing Patrick Brady, and the case kind of fizzled out. However, Brady would counter this by saying that he did meet with Holmes around the time Smith went missing, but that he did not know Jim Smith. Again, this didn't really lead the investigators anywhere, and they were forced to put the case on the back burner for the time being. However, the case would be revived on May 20th of that same year when a distraught Reginald Holmes would leave his home out on his personal speedboat and make way out into the ocean. Now, it was apparent throughout the sources I found on this that Holmes was having some type of mental or nervous breakdown, and when he took his speedboat out that day, he had the intention of taking his own life. Reginald Holmes would raise his .32 caliber handgun to his head and pull the trigger. However, in a shocking turn of events, the .32 caliber bullet did not have enough force to penetrate his skull. It merely flattened against it, and the force of getting shot in the head was enough to topple Holmes overboard. Now, while Holmes is falling overboard, some rope got tangled around his arm, and this saved him from drowning in the water. Now, with a confused Holmes, he had actually managed to climb back aboard his speedboat with a killer headache, and honestly shocked that he wasn't dead. And this was kind of a failed attempt at Holmes trying to take his own life. Again, you're kind of thinking, what did Holmes know? Was Holmes killing himself to basically have information go to the grave with him? Not really fully sure on this. However, during this whole ordeal of Holmes trying to kill himself and not killing himself, the police got calls about this suspicious behavior happening on Holmes's boat out in the harbor, and they were called to investigate. When they arrived, Holmes bolted on his boat and led police on a 4-hour boat chase around the harbor and ocean until eventually he surrendered without violence. At this point, Holmes started cooperating with law enforcement and had agreed to testify against Patrick Brady in the murder of Jim Smith. As it turns out, Holmes, from all accounts, kind of wanted out from this criminal smuggling ring he had going on, and as it turns out again, from the sources I found, it stated that Jim Smith had been working as an informant for the police. So in my opinion, if these facts are true, this is what I think could have happened. Holmes wanted out and viewed Smith as the way to do it. However, Brady was making a pretty penny from these jobs Holmes was sending him on. If Holmes heads for the hills, Brady would miss out on repeated sizable paydays, and he wasn't going to miss out on that chance. Once he found out that his friend, Jim Smith, was an informant working for the police, this is when Brady confronted Holmes and brought Jim's arm as a token of what might happen if he doesn't continue his criminal activities, and maybe he possibly bribed Holmes with it by throwing him under the rug if he didn't pay up. Holmes and Brady, of course, played dumb when law enforcement got involved, and later on perhaps Brady was still blackmailing Holmes, and Holmes at this point, with his path to getting out of this mess seemingly gone, and with the death of Smith, he then tried to kill himself, seeing no other way out. However, now with the possibility of being able to testify against Brady, this allowed him to come full circle and maybe finally get out of this mess once and for all. However, that is my own personal opinion, and I think that's kind of a good, really, synopsis of where we stand so far. However, this story, unfortunately, is not one with a happy ending. Brady was charged with the murder of Jim Smith, and Holmes kept talking, and like I mentioned, agreed to testify. However, on the day he was scheduled to testify, Reginald Holmes was found dead from multiple gunshot wounds slumped over the steering wheel of his car. The original cause of death was determined to be suicide. However, that is a batch of bullshit, because there is no way you shoot yourself 3 times in the chest as a suicide attempt. But that is merely my own synopsis. I'm not a police investigator, but last time I checked, you cannot shoot yourself 3 times in the chest and have it be suicide. But maybe I'm wrong. I have been wrong before. However, it is debated on who killed Holmes. And of course, we will circle back to that here in a minute in the theories portion of this episode. However, when it came to trial for Brady on the murder of Smith, Brady's attorney argued the no body, no crime defense. Even though there was a severed arm of Smith, there was no body proving that Smith could have been possibly not dead, as people have, of course, lived while losing an arm a numerous amount of times. Brady's attorney, Clive Evatt, argued that the verdict not be determined merely on a shark with gastrointestinal issues, and that since there was no body, there was no proof that his client, Patrick Brady, had anything to do with the death of Jim Smith. And with the main testimony against Brady, Reginald Holmes being dead, the case and the only chance of convicting Brady collapsed. Patrick Brady would maintain his innocence, claiming he had nothing to do with the death of Jim Smith or Reginald Holmes, and he took any secrets or the true story of what happened to the grave with him when Brady would die in 1965. We might never know the full story, but we still have a pretty good picture about what happened here. And it kind of makes you think that what if this shark had never vomited up the arm of Jim Smith? That perhaps maybe there would have never been any updates to this case, and Jim Smith would have stayed a missing person to this day. Now, when it comes to the theories part of the episode, what I want to shift to, rather than theories on Jim Smith, because we kind of have this idea that, of course, Brady did it to some degree. But we don't know who killed Reginald Holmes. That remains a mystery. You could say the murder of Jim Smith remains a mystery, but we have reasonable assumption to assume it was Brady, even though he wasn't convicted. But, again, we don't know who killed Reginald Holmes. And to me, that is where I want to focus on for theories. And I want to talk about the many theories that exist about who could have killed Reginald Holmes. So with that being said, let's talk about it. Now, our first theory is, of course, what the cops thought initially. Suicide. Again, I have my feet firmly planted in the ground on this one, that is virtually impossible. He was shot 3 times. However, some people have theorized that Holmes had hired a hitman to kill him instead, in a strange way of suicide. But to me, doesn't make any sense either. From everything I read, it seemed like even though what Holmes did in the cocaine trade was extremely dangerous, he seemed like he wanted out. And with Jim Smith being an informant, he could possibly do that with maybe little penalties from the police, as he then would turn and rat out his associates. Or I guess we would have to assume that at least. Maybe Holmes would, if Jim Smith was an informant, hey, I can use Jim as a way to get out. And then once I use Jim as a way to get out, okay, I can turn and I can rat everybody else, rat on the people above me, rat on people like Patrick Brady, and they'll all go in the clink where I'm scot-free and I'm out living in the world again. To me, that makes sense, but again, that's my own personal theory. Holmes hiring someone to kill himself makes 0 sense, unless those powers that be, maybe those at the top of this underground crime syndicate, threatened his family and said that he must kill himself. But even if that's the case, and this crime organization said, hey, you need to kill yourself. You've done wrong by the family. You're going to turn around and testify. We cannot have this. You got to kill yourself or we'll kill your family. Why would he hire a hitman to do that? Wouldn't he just put a bullet in his head and end it? Maybe. I don't know. There's just too many empty holes here, or unanswered questions. It just doesn't make any sense, in my opinion. Now, the second theory is that this was Brady. This was Patrick Brady's doing. He knew Holmes would tell everything in court and knew that he was going to testify, so he set on a hit or committed the murder himself to make sure Holmes wouldn't talk and expose him or any other members of this crime family. Pretty short, pretty to the point, but that's kind of what I've talked about up to this point, and what we've talked about up to this point is Brady being kind of the major player in this whole story. Now, the last theory I want to talk about is kind of a little bit of a wild card, and that is Eddie Wayman. Now, who is Eddie Wayman? He hasn't come up in our story at any point up to this, and you might be wondering, again, who is this? Who is this? We haven't talked about this. We've talked about Holmes. We've talked about Brady. We've talked about Jim Smith. Who's Eddie Wayman? Now, Eddie Wayman was a pretty notorious criminal during this time period in Sydney, and he had a wealth of criminal connections. According to an author, he proposed that perhaps Eddie Wayman could have played a role in the death of Smith and Holmes. It turns out one of the men that Jim Smith was collecting information on as an informant was Wayman. Perhaps word had got out that Smith was running to the cops with information on Wayman, and this is when Patrick Brady arranged a meetup with Jim Smith, and at the time more information surfaced about Reginald Holmes wanting a way out of the drug trade, and Brady, and quite possibly Wayman, found this as an opportunity to cut off some loose ends. Brady would go on to torture and kill Jim Smith, take his arm as a message for Holmes to stay in the trade, and then when the arm was found barfed up by the shark, and long story short, Holmes emerged as a witness that was going to testify, Brady and Wayman had to clean up more loose ends by killing Holmes and protecting their activities and making sure that neither Holmes or Smith went to the cops to expose their criminal activities. I know this kind of loops together some points I made in the Brady theory, but honestly, this is what I kind of think happened here. And I've gone back and forth in episodes previous. Anybody who has listened to this show, listened to me ramble on and talk for hours on end knows I very often don't feel very slam dunk surefire on some theories, kind of on the fence. I kind of juggle back and forth. This Eddie Wayman theory checks a lot of boxes to me, if in fact this information is true. I checked a couple different sources on this. So these were people that obviously existed. And these were players within the criminal organization. To me, that kind of makes sense. If Wayman was the guy up top pulling the trigger for people like Holmes, like Brady, like Jim Smith, obviously being on kind of like the lower tier, and he found out, again, that whole kind of snippet that I just mentioned, it would make sense to get rid of the loose ends. Hey, you don't want somebody ratting you out. You don't want somebody coming forward, maybe even exposing you, maybe even exposing your boss above you. Again, I don't know how underworld criminal organizations work, but obviously you don't want a rat. You don't want somebody running to the police and exposing your whole scheme and everything else that you do. So to me, the Eddie Wayman theory makes sense. Now, of course, the unsolved aspect of this case is Holmes. Now, Smith, we kind of know Brady did it. But Holmes, I kind of think maybe Eddie Wayman had something to do with it, whether directly or indirectly. Maybe it was Brady, maybe it was Wayman himself, maybe it was a goon that Wayman had hired. One of the two. That's honestly what I think happened, and because of the shady nature of kind of criminal organizations, we're probably never going to know who killed Reginald Holmes. And the fact of the matter is that this is kind of criminal on criminal, makes me think that we might not ever know, because we're not talking about innocent people here. We're talking about criminals who did some really bad things. So that kind of makes me doubt that there's going to be any pushing to try and figure out who killed Reginald Holmes. But with that being said, that is kind of my whole synopsis on this. With the Shark Arm murders, kind of a really cool story. Kind of a very complex story with kind of the moving pieces within this kind of crime organization. Kind of a fun one. Again, if you tuned in, I told you that this was not going to be a boring episode. I hope I agreed. I kind of convinced you that it's not. A lot of moving pieces here. Definitely a different murder kind of mystery than I've covered before. I had a lot of fun researching this one. I kind of got into it a little bit, trying to find what I could in terms of sources and everything like that. And the fact that this is one of, if not Sydney's most famous murder case, honestly is really cool. And we've been to Australia a few times in this show. I haven't been to Australia, but we've been in the show. And up to this point that I had not heard about this until probably 2 weeks ago when I started researching this, is kind of really cool. And I enjoyed researching this one, and I hope you all enjoyed me telling this to you. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me this week on Unblurring the Unknown. I hope you enjoyed this episode on the Shark Arm murders. But with that being said, if you were listening to this show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you listen to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out in the algorithm, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. Also, feel free to check me out on Instagram and TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown. You can send me topic suggestions as well. I highly encourage those. You can send them to my email, which is unblurringtheunknown, all one word, at gmail.com. You can also send them to me via Instagram direct message. I check both of those. I check my comment section. I try to be as active as I can on all my social medias, so feel free to check me out on any one of those, and I greatly appreciate the support. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me today. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.